Hello and welcome to the Beyond Biotech podcast, and this is number 8, and the first in August as 2022 seems to be gathering pace. I'm Jim Cornell from Labiotech.eu, and while the world news seems to be pretty overwhelmingly negative, at least we can try and reflect a bit more on some of the positives when it comes to biotech tackling issues. As far as today's podcast goes, rules are meant to be broken, right? Well, some rules are, I guess. I know I've mentioned how we have 3 interviews a week. Well, not this week. It's 4. But don't worry, it doesn't mean that the podcast is 2 hours long. It's just that last Friday we did a special themed podcast on hepatitis, and so that pushed a couple of interviews back a little. So that meant adding 1 interview to this week's show. But we should still be around the same time, because the good news is it means less of me talking. And again, like last week, one of the interviews I didn't do. We have another debut for the podcast. I can't really say that I have a lot of news this week anyway. When you work all week and the weekend is wet, there's not much to say. I have been watching the Commonwealth Games though, even though I promised not to, and it's been a bit of a conflict, as I'm from England, spent a couple of decades in Canada, and now live in Scotland. Divided loyalties. I also did stay up late to watch the baseball trade deadline last week, and I shouldn't have. I did get some new equipment this week, a new podcast microphone, so we're testing that out right now, but I still sound the same. So I should fill you in on who the guests on the podcast are this week, and there are 5 of them across 4 interviews. It was a debut for Labiotech's John Smith, who talked with Laura Fletcher, Head of Business Development and Strategic Partnerships at Deep Science Ventures. I chatted with Matthias Steger, CEO of Endogena Therapeutics, and then I did an interview with 2 people from eureKARE, the company's CEO, Rudolph Besserve, and the new Chief of Biotech Studio Development, Georges Rawadi. And over in the US, I had a conversation with the portfolio manager for the Biotech Growth Trust, Geoff Hsu. And that brings us to this week's news at Labiotech.eu. And to say that there's a lot is a bit of an understatement. There's no way that I could read through them all, so you'll just have to go to the website and check them all out. A shameless plug there. Speaking of plugs, we do accept advertising on the podcast, so if you're interested in that, just head over to the website and reach out to us there. Okay, the news. The hold on a colorectal cancer drug has been lifted by the FDA. Cenas Biopharma has received approval in China for a study on thyroid eye disease, and BioMedX Institute and Merck have started a new oncology project. We had 3 articles on the biggest biotech investments in Europe, Asia Pacific and the US, and we had an article on deciphering the molecular mechanisms of severe COVID-19. Chinese biotech company Cyronax closed a $200 million funding round. Orca Bio announced its Precision T Phase 3 study is enrolling patients at US transplant centers, and 11 Therapeutics sealed $22 million in funding. A new monkeypox tracing method can analyse multiple samples and quickly detect virus strains. We had an article on tackling mosquito-borne diseases. IDRx launched with $122 million in funding to treat cancer with precision combination therapies, and the FDA gave the green light to a Crystal Biotech cystic fibrosis clinical trial. Defense Therapeutics said its Accutox product can kill cancer cells. Selectus got the OK to start a non-Hodgkin lymphoma trial, and Immunis closed a $10 million financing round. Amgen has acquired ChemoCentryx for $3.7 billion. Novavax has started a COVID vaccine trial for children from aged 6 months to 11 years, and Gilead Science is set to buy MyroBio for $405 million. F2G is pushing its antifungal agent forward with $70 million in new funding. Polypid is receiving millions for the commercialization of an infection-fighting drug, and a new breast cancer treatment received funding. And you can read all about these and a whole lot more at Labiotech.eu. It was a tricky one this week deciding which conversation goes first, as we have 4 good ones this week, so we will start with a company that is starting a clinical trial to treat blindness caused by retinitis pigmentosa. It's a really interesting story, and the company involved is Endogena Therapeutics. To tell us about the company and what it is doing is the CEO, Matthias Steger.
Endogena Therapeutics is all about endogenous regenerative medicines. What we mean by that is that we regulate with small molecules our own, hence endogenous stem and progenitor cells, to repair and regenerate organs and tissues. So that's a novel drug discovery approach that could actually lead to a treatment paradigm change, because as of today, there are no drugs that treat degenerative diseases. And it's a problem, because degenerative diseases are very complex diseases that involve many pathways in our body. And so the general drug discovery approach, how it worked so far, you link one target to a specific disease and you block or activate that target to cure the disease. That doesn't work in these complex diseases. So you need to have a more holistic approach, and that's what we do at Endogena Therapeutics.
I would assume as well that there are many degenerative diseases, and of course the aging process, I would assume that they're all very different.
That's correct, exactly. That's why we have created, so underlying the concept that what I described to you is actually an artificial intelligence machine learning platform where we elucidate specific pattern recognitions, patterns in small molecules, and we link them to specific stem and progenitor cells. So we have different small molecular patterns that activate liver progenitor cells to brain progenitor cells to retina progenitor cells, etc., etc. So we do this very specifically, and we do this by a machine learning algorithm because our eyes would not be able to see that, because the problem at hand is too complex for us to process, actually.
And I guess the most recent thing that you're working on is retinitis pigmentosa. I wonder if you could give me some background on that condition.
That's correct, exactly. So that is our first and furthest advanced project where we apply the concept that I described before. So retinitis pigmentosa is a genetic, albeit very heterogenetic disease. So more than 80 genes are known to be involved in the cause of the disease. And the disease is a blinding disease. So what that means that usually patients have up to their early adulthood, so around 20, they have completely normal eyesight. And then the degeneration of the photoreceptor starts, which are the light-sensitive cells, the photoreceptors. And there are 2 types of photoreceptors, the rods, which are responsible for night vision and peripheral vision. And there are cones that are responsible for light and color vision. And first, the rods degenerates. That leads to this typical tunnel vision that you may have seen in images, that depict retinitis pigmentosa patients' view and night blindness. But once the rods are degenerated, then the retina loses its structure, and then also the cone degenerates, and then the patient gets totally blind. This is a process over 10 to 30 years, depending on the genetic background. So it's a rather slow progressing disease, but there is nothing that can stop this disease. And this goes back now to the stem cell biology that really evolved in the last 15 years after Shinya Yamanaka, the Japanese researcher, made this breakthrough discovery of reprogramming adult to pluripotent stem cells. After that, it was possible to do this. All this stem cell research came out. And out of this research, one of the key findings was that up until we die, each of us, we have a pool of progenitor cells for most tissues and organs to regenerate functional cells, but not so in the eye. Albeit there is a pool that we have found now of retinal stem cells that reside in the front of the eye, in the ciliary marginal zone. But these retinal stem cells, they are in a quiescent state. So that means when we have an injury in the eye, they don't get activated and they don't start the repair mechanisms. And that's why we go blind, and there is no stopping of us getting blind. And now we apply the endogena approach here. We have identified a molecule that can activate these retinal stem cells and get them out of their quiescent state. Now, the whole eye by developmental biology in the embryonal phase was constructed from these retinal stem cells. But once from the front to the back, once the eye has been completed, these retinal stem cells, they go into this quiescent state and they are not reactivated. But why I tell you this is that once we get them activated, these retinal stem cells, to put it in simple terms, they know where to go and they know what to become. So even though they reside in the front of the eye, and we have data for all of this, of course, produced in vivo studies, they then migrate through the whole eye. They differentiate into photoreceptors. They integrate into the retina, and they form a connection to the ganglion cells to transmit the light signal to the brain. Again, we have demonstrated all of that in very fascinating in vivo studies that then led us now to treating patients.
And at what point in the process are you able to help with this? Do you have to catch this early, or does it work with people that already have some of the symptoms like the tunnel vision?
So that is the big advantage that we have over gene therapy, for example, because gene therapy, the best that gene therapy can do, it corrects the underlying genetic disorder and can stop the further degeneration. But the vision that is lost is lost. Whereas our approach can really regenerate. And again, we have done an in vivo study in blind mice. And we have demonstrated that over time, these mice regained vision. So they were blind and they regained vision. So yes, very good question, obviously, but we have strong hope that we can regain vision, especially if we catch patients fairly early when they only have the tunnel vision and have not lost the total retinal structure, like the rods and the cones. But at that stage, exactly, I think that our approach could work very well. But of course, also what we have demonstrated is that, and that's also underlying stem cell biology, the body regulates itself. So we only produce as much photoreceptors as are needed. We have also seen that in vivo studies. So we can treat also patients very early to even prevent the start of the degeneration or at the very beginning of the degeneration to work there, yeah.
And how is it administered? Is it just a one-time administration, or do you have to repeat this over time?
So it's an intravitreal injection that is being done millions of times every day around the world now with these anti-VEGF therapies for the wet AMD indication. And our injection schedule at the moment is 4 times over 4 weeks. So once a week over 4 weeks. And after that, the patient has a treatment holiday for 6 months or even a year. The rationale behind that is the following. We activate, as I said before, the retinal stem cells. We kick them out of their quiescent state, but afterwards, they know what to do. But this takes time. So in the embryonal development phase, the eye is built over, I think, around 6 months, right? And that's exactly what we have seen also in vivo models. Even though our molecule was not there anymore for months, the mice still improved in vision. And that's exactly our hypothesis, that we work with our body to kind of heal itself. We need to kick these progenitor cells out of their quiescent state, but then they do their job. And they do their job as long as they need it to do. So for skin cells, repair faster, or muscle cells than, for example, retinal cells. But that's exactly what we have seen. And so we have a schedule of injections, but then afterwards we have a fairly long treatment holiday. Just to add, it is a chronic treatment because we do not correct the underlying genetic defect, but because it takes a long time, as I described before in the disease, the degeneration over 10 to 30 years, we believe with our approach, we always have enough sufficient time to regenerate always these photoreceptors again.
I guess if it's something that's passed on from one generation to another, the fact that you're treating people with it kind of gives you a clue as to maybe the next generation would need that treatment as well.
That's a very good point, Jamie. Yes, absolutely. So because it's a genetic disorder, I mean, if you want, right, then you know whether your kid got it or not. You can make these tests and then you can really start treating early and even prevent the degeneration to even start. Absolutely. Yeah.
Very good news for those people that have it. Absolutely. And I guess you're about to undertake phase 1 and 2 studies. Could you tell me about those?
Yeah, so it's actually, as a scientist, researcher, being in the industry now for more than 20 years, it's a big pleasure we started Endogena not even 6 years ago from this pure hypothesis. And now last quarter already, in the second quarter 2022, we have started to treat patients with our drug. So we are very excited that we could bring this hope now to these PH people who don't have anything yet to be treated with. So yes, we have started. So far, all good. And yes, we will see. Of course, it takes, as I described to you before, results we expect in a year from now or so, So again, this takes time, the regenerative process. Obviously, because it's the first treatment of patients actually already. Safety is at the utmost importance first, but then we also have some efficacy measures that potentially may show a signal. We'll be looking into that, but firstly safety, and so far that looks good for us, but we will see. We are only just started, yeah.
Sure. And where are the people that you're working with located? Are they all local to you or in different places?
So Endogena Therapeutics is a US incorporated company, but really, so I am Swiss and the team is mainly based here in Zurich, Switzerland, which is not a bad place for the pharmaceutical industry to be in. And then we have a discovery biology site in Toronto, where we have moved into the Johnson & Johnson incubator JLabs, which is great for us to have access to labs as a small company there, fully equipped modern labs. The reason for that is that with all of our projects that we carry out in Endogena, we are the drug discovery experts. So we always partner with the expert in the stem cell biology field. And Professor van der Kooi was actually the researcher at the University of Toronto who identified and was able to isolate these retinal stem cells. So I partnered with Professor van der Kooi very early, and we were able to access these retinal stem cells to start our in vitro studies from him. And because it's very difficult to these cells to transport around the world. So we have opened a lab in Toronto next to Professor van der Kooi's research lab, and that was fantastic and still is. So Toronto is anyway for us, it's really a fantastic place to do research with. There are many good researchers in stem cell biology and also in particular also in the eye.
And so are there any other things that are in your pipeline at different stages right now?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So as mentioned in the introduction, it's really Endogena Therapeutics is really a platform company, but platform in the sense of not a technology, but this novel drug discovery approach. And we have applied our approach already for hematopoietic stem cell regeneration after bone marrow transplantation, where we regenerate blood cells. And we're also working on a lung cell regeneration project. But the second furthest advanced is actually also in the eye. It's really also huge unmet medical need for dry AMD. So the anti-VEGF therapies, they work only for 20% of the AMD population, the wet AMD patient population, but for 80%, there is no treatment at all available. And very excitingly, we have now an in vivo proof of concept there where we demonstrated the regeneration of RPE cells. Again, that's totally novel. That has thought not to be possible. And we have now also a lot of ophthalmologists very excited about this project that will go into the clinic next year. And because we work with small molecules according to developmental pathways, so the retinal pigment epithelium that we regenerate is in a different developmental pathway than the photoreceptors, which is more neuroectoderm. This is also a different molecule. So all of our molecules they are novel and target different pool of progenitor cells according to developmental biology.
Is there anything else that you wanted to add about the company?
Yeah, we are very excited about the progress that we make in the clinic and towards the clinic now with AMD. It's going well, and we are excited to work with the patients now.
Now we talk to two people from eureKARE. It's an investment company building biotech companies in the field of synthetic biology, and it just launched its first studio in Belgium. To tell us what the studios are and what they do, and the person you will hear from first is Rudolph Besserve, the company's CEO. And then taking up the story is the new Chief of Biotech Studio Development, the biotech veteran Georges Rawadi.
So eureKARE is an investment company that we started 18 months ago, so it's quite a recent story. So investing in the biotech fields, and more specifically in two segments, which are synthetic biology and microbiome. And over the last few months, we decided to put the focus on synthetic biology, and we invest in three different ways. Very early stage, that's what we will discuss, I think, today with the biotech studio model. So really taking some projects from the academics, structuring them and financing them to create new ventures. We invest also in the mid to late stage companies, very selectively, so making sort of big bets on companies which we think have a lot of potential. Last but not least, we also invest in listed companies. We launched a couple of months ago our first SPAC. When I say first, maybe it will be the only one, but at this stage, it's the first one. It's a SPAC dedicated to biomanufacturing, so where we see, of course, potential impact from SynBio in this field. And the purpose is also in the future to continue investing, probably through a dedicated fund to SynBio in listed companies, not only in Europe, but also outside Europe. So the early stage and mid to late stage is dedicated to European companies. And listed companies, we are looking worldwide, I would say. So that's eureKARE in a nutshell. And we are a team of 9 people now. I will let Georges then discussing about the biotech studio models, and I think it's really at the core of what we want to do. Yeah.
Could you first explain a little bit about what synthetic biology is for those that aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, sure. So SynBio, there are many definitions. The most common one is the synthesis of DNA and gene, or even in the future, maybe a whole cell. We take it as it is, but beyond this, we look also at potential applications. So in biomedical, we include gene therapy. For environmental applications, many industrial process, for instance, industrial biotechnology. We include also synthetic food, for instance. So again, there are many definitions. We've got a wide definition as far as eureKARE is concerned.
To complement what Rudolph just said in a comprehensive way, well, synthetic biology is indeed a field of science that involves re-engineering organisms generally to make them doing things that originally they are not necessarily doing, but we make them useful and to provide them in new abilities, new capacities. And this is by engineering their genome and their metabolism. And this is applicable to microorganisms. This is applicable to cells, yeast, plants, any living organism on Earth that we can re-engineer and to actually derive useful purposes out of it. This is synthetic biology.
And so could you explain the concept of the synthetic biology studios that you're setting up and what will take place in them?
Indeed. So today we are kind of building up a new model to invest in synthetic biology because we believe in Europe there is an untapped science in the field of synthetic biology. And we have as a vision and ambition to make Europe as a leader in synthetic biology. So we act as actually a bridge between academia and industry by identifying challenges where synthetic biology can bring solution. This could be biotherapies in medicine, in health, and environment, as well as in bioproduction, as was just stated by Rudolph. And then we identify scientists that are capable of addressing these challenges because of their expertise in the synthetic biology field. And with them, we bring the innovation into proof of concept. And then we give all the needed, background to this innovation to grow and to develop by providing initial financing from eureKARE fund, but also bringing additional investor potentially with us. We provide all the support on the management, the IP side, and basically leaving the scientists to continue focusing on the innovation to generate a proof of concept. And when the proof of concept are generated, then we help the company to basically grow to larger scale industrial setting. So really investing and taking an early stage by an active approach instead of waiting people to come to us. We identify the challenges, the scientists, and we go to them. And for that, we are supported by an AI tool that we have built in-house and we continue developing to detect the early signal of innovation from what is published, not only as scientific paper, but also on the social media that now becomes more and more a way to communicate science to, and to also identify those untapped researchers that have a great idea, and we give them the means to accomplish their innovation.
So the first one is in Belgium. Can you tell me the reasoning or how Belgium came to be the first one?
Yes, we see synthetic biology being applied to multiple fields. One of them is health challenges and biotherapies. And Belgium is a country that has been focusing, and this was the kind of a political decision, on biotherapies and on biotechs in general. So we feel that in Belgium there is a good environment for the development of our biotherapies, biotech studios. But I want to emphasize that we are doing this across Europe. So we are not only attracting Belgium science in the Belgium biotech studio, we are attracting scientists and innovation from all over Europe. So we will reach, and we are reaching to scientists across Europe to join us in the Belgian biotech. And this is what we will do in other biotech studios that we'll set in other countries to address other challenges where synthetic biology is applicable.
Do you have any other locations set yet for the rest of the studios?
Well, we have many locations in mind. The good news is that Europe and the science in Europe is well developed. There are great scientists, I should say, in most European countries. This is including France, certainly Germany, Holland, and others. So we are contemplating to have multiple biotech studios in different countries. Those are today in consideration. And there is a question also, as you can see, after the COVID-19 of European sovereignty to control technologies that potentially in the future are very important for our health and for our society. So there is also a European consideration out there and not only national consideration.
And will the focus of these different studios in different countries be different?
Completely. We believe that environment is also a challenge where synthetic biology can bring an added value. For instance, we can think about bacteria that can fix carbon and the CO2 in the air, in the environment, and transform it into something else useful. We can think about bacteria that fluoresce and help in lightening and reducing our energy use or electric energy, about how bacteria can treat waste and potentially transform it into a useful material. So there are many, I think, challenges around environment questions that synthetic biology. So there is, I think, a good ground for having a biotech studio around these questions. Bioproduction is one of them. Future therapies will be mostly biotherapies, whether those are proteins, cell, or gene therapy. And you will need certainly a way or a good way to manufacture those. So this is also something that we are strongly interested in, how synthetic biology can improve the manufacturing, the scale-up of the manufacturing, or reducing the cost of the manufacturing. And, there are other ideas around also IT and data storage, with the concept of storing data into genetic material instead of storing it into server and hard drive, and also with the object of reducing energy consumption and use. So you see, it can be very broad and go from therapies to IT. So we will form multiple biotech studios, and each will have a different and very specific scope.
What's the timeline for this? I mean, have you already started on the work in the studio in Belgium?
Completely. So the Belgium studio was launched last week. So we've started the studio as a company, as an investment company, and we have already multiple projects that we are assessing right now. And with the expectations that in the coming months, we will start our first ventures within the studios to address, I would say, challenges around health and around biotherapies.
You're relatively new at the company. What could you tell me what your role will be there and how you will work with these different studios?
Indeed. So I joined very recently eureKARE, coming with a strong background in biotechs and different roles. So my role will be overseeing this network of biotech studios across Europe and helping the team to build the biotech studios, to build the ventures or the startups within those biotech studios, actually also helping in sourcing, selecting and pushing forward the different technologies that we would like to push. So I will act as a coordinator of those biotech studios, and each will have its own management team over time and in due time.
And in terms of timescales, obviously each one will be different, but what are the long-term goals for the studios?
Well, what we want is for each studio to have its own pipeline of startups and technologies, to mature them and take them to a proof of concept. So this is something new. We are the first to do that in Europe. So we have a kind of a business plan in mind that we will need to adapt as we move forward. But today we want to select technologies that can provide an added value across different applications. So we are focusing on getting those companies off the ground, providing, money and generating the proof of concept. And then for each technology, there is going to be a story, but we want to see potentially at least some of these companies growing and becoming a licorn in Europe. We are here to stay long. We are here to support the field in an active way, but also over time, because it will take some time to mature the field and bring it to the level of success we would like to achieve.
Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about the company and your plans?
I just wanted to remind that, we are taking really an innovative way to make investment in this disruptive area. And with the idea of having Europe as a leader in the synthetic biology field, and us supporting the innovation and driving some what we believe will going to be disruptive technology in the field to the market.
Now it's to the debut podcast interview from Labiotech's John Smith, and he interviewed Laura Fletcher, who is the Head of Business Development and Strategic Partnerships at Deep Science Ventures. The company has expanded its partnership with Cancer Research UK to establish new oncology startups across the UK.
It would be great if you could just give a quick description about what is Deep Science Ventures. What does the company do?
Sure. Well, firstly, thanks for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate the chance to tell you a bit more about this. So Deep Science Ventures is a venture builder. We build companies from scratch. We do that across a number of sectors, actually, not just within therapeutics, but we also operate across climate, agri-tech and computation as well. So really, we have this holistic vision of building transformative companies in areas that require major shifts to enable human and planetary thriving. So that's our vision, if you like, for the future. We are also an investor, but we just invest in the companies that we build ourselves. And we do that in a way that is really, I think, very different from any other venture builder. So rather than going out scouting for the latest innovations and inventions from academia and looking at how best to translate those, we instead turn that model on its head. So we start with what are the very specific outcomes that we would like to achieve. And then we work backwards from that thesis, really looking across the whole landscape of scientific knowledge that's available to us. And we ideate a novel solution to address that problem in-house. So it's really almost like taking an engineering approach to science. We look at all the available tools, knowledge, building blocks, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and then we figure out what would the very best solution to that problem look like. How close can we get to that? And then really we spin out the company in that space with that hypothesis or that concept and some pre-seed funding to test that and generate proof of concept data. So our companies are super early when we set them off on this journey. But I think because of this engineering approach, then a lot of elements of what they're doing are already de-risked. We tend to pick components that have, some proven capabilities in other areas. So there's actually a really high success rate for these companies, even though starting really early, to go on and prove out these concepts. So we've built 35 companies to date now across those 4 sectors. And we're continuing to build companies apace. So we hope to be creating another 10 or so this year. We're working on 4 currently within the pharma team. So yeah, that's a very brief rundown of who we are and what we do.
For our readers that are not in the UK, I might not be aware, what exactly is Cancer Research UK and what is your kind of background with the charity?
Sure. So Cancer Research UK is actually the largest independent funder of cancer research globally. So within the UK and now beyond the UK borders, they fund around £500 million of research in oncology every year, and that's spread across the preclinical and clinical space. So as you can imagine, they generate huge amounts of new knowledge and data through that process. And they also have a rather unusual model of taking a very strong hand in the commercialization of the outputs of that research. So rather than the IP generated from that sitting with individual universities and institutes, Cancer Research UK has a mechanism of centralising that and pooling IP and knowledge, and they have a very strong translational arm that was just relaunched actually in Cancer Research Horizons, which brings together all of that translatable IP, the translational funding streams around that, but also then a really strong infrastructure in translational science itself. So they have drug discovery labs and teams of actually very industry experienced biologists and chemists to push forward these new discoveries. So they're very focused on, as you would expect really, on finding the routes to patient impact from the work that they fund. So for us, again, DSV, we are an impact-driven organisation, an impact-driven investor, and finding organisations that really share that vision and that are willing and open-minded to try some new routes to innovation. That's really important for us. So they were a very natural partner for us when we first engaged with them back in late 2019 now.
What is the kind of latest, therefore, on your partnership with Cancer Research UK?
Well, the first wave of the partnership was really a great success, I think, for both parties. So we spun 3 companies out in 2021 off the back of that partnership that we signed in late 2019, which was actually 3/4 of all the companies at CRUK span out that year. So, that was the real healthy validation for us in terms of the approach that we're taking. And those companies will focus on 3 really diverse problems within cancer treatment and are taking some very diverse approaches to solve those problems. So it was really off of that success that we began talking then about how could the next wave of a partnership look. And with the relaunch of Cancer Research Horizons as well, just a few months ago, the restructure of that translational infrastructure at CRUK, then it made sense for us to deepen the partnership by involving that arm of the charity much more deeply in the next wave of companies that we build together. So the model now this time round will be that those labs will act actually as an incubator site for the companies that we spin out. So those scientists at Cancer Research Horizons will be the hands on deck to help execute the proof of concept work. They will provide space to the new company and the founders that we've brought on board as part of that process. So it'll be a really deeply collaborative effort, not just to come up with the concept for the company and spin it out, but then to launch those companies as successfully as possible through that incubation process for the first 12 or 18 months. So we're hoping that will really accelerate the timelines from which we can go from concept to proof of concept by putting on these highly qualified teams of scientists from the translational labs there. So for us, it's a really exciting development, and it means that we can add, obviously they're a great partner because of knowledge and networks and so on, but to be able to add that hands-on capability is really exciting, I think.
So why is it important to be founding these kind of new cancer research startups in the UK?
Well, I think it's important all over the world, really, despite obviously the billions that are ploughed into cancer research every year. Then currently the statistics still tell us that a third of us will die from cancer. So there's clearly an awful lot of room for new curative therapies in the space. And some tumour types, obviously, we've seen massive advances in prospects if you were diagnosed with that cancer. And then in other tumour types, your prospects are not much better than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So we've seen these very exciting advances around certain types of immunotherapies, whether that be cell-based therapies or checkpoint inhibitor therapies. And some patients do indeed respond really, really well. But equally, there are huge subsets of patients that respond very poorly or don't respond at all or develop quite rapid resistance to these sorts of therapies. So there's clearly still very high unmet need for finding new ways to tackle that. And we've seen now, I think, a glimpse of the power of the immune system when you can make it work the right way. But really, I think we feel at DSV that there's still a lot of that that's untapped. So that's where we chose to focus our efforts for the first of the next builds that we'll do with Cancer Research UK, which we hope will be one of a number of companies. But that was a really clear place for us to start.
Can you give some examples of ways that these companies might be able to tackle cancers that are resistant to immunotherapy?
Well, what we started off with actually in this partnership was looking at some specific tumours that are of high unmet need still, and sort of looking at, well, what's different, what's interesting, what's special about those. And what we observed was, for example, we looked at esophageal, which is still poorly treated. It's on CRUK's sort of high priority list of cancers of unmet need. What you see there is that those tumours actually have really high levels of infiltrating immune cells, and they have high levels of tumour specific mutations. So that's generally what's required for the immune system to see that tumour as foreign and be able to tackle it. Yet they're poorly responsive to these immunotherapies. So that was a sort of an interesting conundrum for us. They tend to be flooded with immune suppressive cells and factors, as well as having the more positive components of the immune system. When you look out across other cancer types, you find a number of other tumour types that have that same characteristic. So where we're starting actually is looking at what can we do to really flip that phenotype within the tumour to relieve that immunosuppression in novel ways. Now that's obviously a very multifactorial microenvironment within the tumour, and as you might see from a number of the other companies that we've built, what we tend to do is we tackle the complexity of the problem with a multimodal approach as well. So probably similarly in this case, what we'll be looking to do is not just to tweak one target or one cell, but we are at the early stages of designing an approach that will intervene in a number of different pathways and drivers of that immunosuppression within the tumour. So we're at the fairly early stages of figuring out exactly what that approach will be. We've just brought on the founding analyst, or proto-founder if you like, who will work with us hand in hand to dive deeply now into defining the exact approach. But that's the general direction of travel.
I'm also really interested in another thing about this recent announcement that you're targeting neurofibromatosis. Can you explain a bit about this condition and what treatments there are and why you're working on this particular condition?
Yeah, sure. So we're pretty excited that the Children's Tumour Foundation have decided to join us in the alliance with Cancer Research UK. And I guess just as a sort of a side note, part of how we've set up that alliance is with a vision of bringing on additional partners like Children's Tumour Foundation to help us focus in specific opportunity areas. outside of the ones we've initially identified with Cancer Research UK. So we struck up a conversation with the Children's Tumour Foundation, and really through discussion with them, we became very passionate about trying to figure out whether DSV's approach to innovation could come up with some new solutions in this space. So neurofibromatosis is a rare genetic disease, or a set of rare genetic diseases. It has the same sort of incidence as cystic fibrosis, actually. So it's not sort of super rare, but it is a collection of different genetic diseases which manifest in different ways, but they all cause tumours to grow throughout the nervous system. Oftentimes these are benign tumours, but because of the locations of where they grow, they cause enormous complications for patients, both physically but also through extreme debilitating pain. So it's really a very difficult disease to live with. In rare cases, some of those tumours do go on to be malignant as well, and when they do so, they're incredibly aggressive. There are very few treatment options available for patients now with any type of neurofibromatosis. So it really is a space that needs a drive for identifying, novel ways of treating these patients who can have really compromised quality of life. Very often management is sort of surgical, trying to debulk tumours, pain relief, so just managing symptoms, chemo in some cases to shrink tumours, again, not curative. And then very recently, just in the last couple of years, then there's been some look at repurposing of existing drugs. So the very first targeted agent, if you like, for neurofibromatosis 1 was approved just in 2020. So that's a MEK inhibitor, which will act to shrink the growth of these tumours. So it does work quite well to shrink tumours. It's not curative, but it's progress. It shows that there are ways in which you can intervene in this disease. But in the other types, NF2 and schwannomatosis, there are literally no targeted treatment options at all. So we hope that there's a lot we can do in the space. It is a really complex disease. The genetic drivers are varied. In some cases, you have secondary genetic hits that are required to kick the disease off as well. So we're very well aware that it's a really big challenge, but we're excited to give it a try and see what we can come up with. We'll also be working with them to identify areas of research that we think need deeper investment in order to progress the science to a point where therapies could be innovated off the back of that. So it's really a kind of a twofold approach to this. One is, can we build new ventures in the space? But the second is, can we identify translational areas of research for the charity to further invest in?
And now it's over to the US via the UK, kind of. The Biotech Growth Trust, which invests in biotech companies, is based in the UK, and it just published its annual report. To tell us about the Biotech Growth Trust and its activities is the portfolio manager, Geoff Hsu, who is at OrbiMed Capital in the US.
The Biotech Growth Trust is a closed-end investment trust based in the UK that is looking to invest in the best opportunities globally in biotech. OrbiMed, the firm that I work for, has been responsible for the portfolio management of the trust since May of 2005. We actually took over management of the trust from another manager at the time, and I have been the portfolio manager continuously since May of 2005.
I guess in the last couple of years, we've seen one issue after another with headwinds from COVID, and then in the UK, we've had Brexit. Now there's a war in Eastern Europe. How have all these things affected the company and the fund?
Sure. So a lot of the macro factors that you identified, inflation, the war in Ukraine is part of that, of course. And I think just a general movement among investors out of a lot of the growth stocks, especially the early stage growth stocks, into value stocks. That's certainly been a market-wide phenomenon that has unfortunately had a negative impact on the trust over the past 12 to 18 months. COVID, of course, was a reason to get into biotech over the course of 2020. The biotech industry was fairly well insulated from a lot of the COVID pandemic restrictions and lockdowns because they were regarded as essential businesses. And of course, they were working on what we now have as effective vaccines for COVID. So people were, I think, very enthusiastic about the biotech industry generally during this very unusual medical-based crisis, if you will. But unfortunately, once COVID was sort of brought under control, became more, I think, viewed as a manageable phenomenon, if you will, people really started repositioning their portfolios for what they call a reopening trade, which is what are the businesses that had to be shut down and really saw their economics curtailed due to COVID. Now we're getting out of the COVID crisis, those particular stocks would therefore be the ones most likely to rebound in a sort of post-COVID environment. And I think a lot of the investors who don't normally invest in biotech, but who did start investing in 2020, basically exited the sector. We call them investor tourists, if you will. They're not people who normally on a year in, year out basis invest in biotech, but opportunistically they did so in part because of COVID during the peak of the crisis. And so, unfortunately, a lot of those investors, I think, have left the sector. Our firm belief is that the fundamentals of the sector are still very strong and nothing has really changed there. But I do think there have been some macro dynamics, including the recent rise in interest rates that have impaired early stage tech companies, including biotech.
Do you think that's just a temporary blip, or do you think that will continue?
So my personal belief is that the Fed will indeed raise interest rates in the short term to combat inflation. But I think that inflation will cool fairly quickly. And in fact, if you look at the 10-year government yields, they've basically stabilized here at around 3% and are essentially both pricing in the immediate rate hikes we're expecting from the Fed, but also pricing in rate reductions once inflation has been tamed. So my personal view is that this spike in interest rate is relatively short term. I do think it will be effective in cooling down inflation. And then my expectation is that rates would drop again. And hopefully we will get to a more normalized low interest rate environment. So the incremental pressure on the biotech sector from here due to interest rate changes, we think is going to be very, very limited. In other words, the market has already priced in a number of future Fed price hikes in the short term that's already well reflected in market expectations in biotech share prices. And if anything, if those interest rates subsequently decline, that should be a tailwind for the sector.
What is your company's strategy when it comes to investment in biotech, and has that changed because of these issues that we've seen recently?
So the biotech universe, of course, consists of larger cap companies, what we sometimes call major biotech companies that are very well established, have a diversified portfolio of drugs, are profitable, and trade on very conventional metrics like PE multiples, revenue growth, and so forth. And then there's a much larger contingent of companies in the biotech space that we call emerging biotech. Some of them have already commercialized their first drug. Many of them have not actually gotten their first drug approved by the FDA and are therefore loss-making. And I would say that this portfolio, the Biotech Growth Trust, does tilt more towards those earlier stage emerging biotech names. And the reason for that, as I outlined in the presentation, is that when we look at the source of innovation in biotech, the share of innovation that is being delivered by the emerging biotech part of the space has been growing over this past several years and now makes up a majority of the innovation going on in the whole drug development industry. And so we wanted to match our positioning in the portfolio to match sort of where the source of innovation was coming from. Unfortunately, in the past 12 to 18 months, it's exactly those types of companies, unprofitable companies, earlier stage companies who, that got hurt the most in this most recent downturn. We have not decided to change our positioning at all in light of this. We feel like actually that being overweight some of the smaller and mid-cap names in the space right now is exactly where we want to be in order to catch what we regard as an overdue recovery rally. So we think absolute valuations have just contracted to an unprecedented low level. And from here on out, we would expect those beaten down names to recover the most over the next few months.
So maybe the fact that they're low is a good reason to get in as opposed to get out.
That's right. Exactly.
And that downturn that you just mentioned, is that something that you're seeing across the entire biotech sector? And also, are you seeing that globally, or is it just in certain parts of it and in certain locations?
I would say that the downturn in unprofitable tech companies has been fairly market wide. And again, there's a slide in our annual general meeting deck of a custom basket of stocks that Goldman Sachs has put together of unprofitable tech companies across all industries. And in that particular basket, only 12% of the stocks there are healthcare, but you can see that it's down 60% from the beginning of the last fiscal year, March 31st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022. So it has been a market-wide phenomenon. We have seen a sell-off in Chinese biotech as well, but that's, I think, mostly due to other macro factors that are particular to China, including regulatory tightening in that geography and COVID lockdowns in that geography and so forth. But I would say European biotech has also been affected by this recent downturn. So I would say, yes, most biotechs in most geographies have been affected by this most recent downturn.
And the recovery, will that be similarly at the same rates in different countries, do you think, or will that be at different pace?
So I'm probably most optimistic about the United States in terms of a near-term recovery, just because the valuations have gotten so low now, where over 25% of biotech companies are now trading at market caps below the net cash of their balance sheet. So essentially negative enterprise values. I've never seen valuations that low in the 20 years that I've been investing in biotech. And so I think the immediate recovery story, in my view, is most apparent in the United States. But I do think eventually Chinese biotech and other geographies will also recover.
Do you think that then it's just really a case of being patient and waiting for some of these companies to, because I guess if you're in certain parts of biotech, the drug pipeline can take many years to realize. So just patience.
Yeah, so I think some patience is required. I think encouragingly, if you look at the performance of the XBI, which is a small and mid-cap biotech index, it has started outperforming the S&P 500 over the past couple of weeks. So I think we might very well be in the early stages of a recovery in biotech specifically. And so, yes, it's important to be patient, but hopefully we don't have to be patient for that long.
Right. So as far as your own company is concerned, what are you seeing as the short-term and long-term, I guess, headwinds and opportunities?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I think R&D pipelines are still very robust. I think the regulatory environment in terms of the FDA's attitude towards the approval of new drugs remains very, very constructive. I do think M&A activity will pick up over the next few months just because the valuations of some of these biotech targets has gotten so low. And we have seen some M&A recently. And there is one political event that's going on right now, which is the US Congress is now debating drug pricing legislation. We think that legislation is very manageable for the industry. The Democrats are rushing to pass that legislation prior to the midterm elections because they want to be able to secure some sort of legislative win to show to their constituents. So we think there's a decent likelihood that something will pass. But in our view, actually, that's a clearing event for the sector, because whenever drug pricing is debated in Washington, D.C., it tends to dampen valuations of biotech and pharma. And so as long as there's some certainty that comes out of Congress on sort of what the outlook is going to be, I think that could lead to a relief rally.
That's good. Globally, do you think that that's a similar situation?
So I think globally, a lot of the trends that I just mentioned are very much true as well. So innovation is still very strong. Regulatory environment, I think, is still very constructive. The drug pricing legislation, of course, that I mentioned is U.S. specific, but I think a lot of the fundamentals of the industry, M&A, I think, is also something that we could see pick up outside the United States. So a lot of those trends are applicable worldwide.
All right, that's great. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I would just say that in our view, given the low valuations, but the strong fundamentals of the industry, this is an excellent buying opportunity to get invested in biotech if you are a long-term investor with a long-term horizon. And we are expecting a strong recovery, hopefully in the near term, for the sector.
And that's it for another week. I expect we'll revert to 3 interviews next week, and it's also business as usual because I have no idea who the guests are going to be. Plenty in the pipeline though, so to speak. And the week after, I'm hoping we will have a podcast previewing BioEurope. That's taking place in Leipzig in Germany in October, and I can't believe it's not that too far into the future now. But I'm looking forward to visiting the city for the first time and maybe even meeting some of the readers of Labiotech.eu and listeners to this podcast. So I'll head off and do some flight searches in the hope that not all of the flights are sold out and that I don't end up having to go via Madrid. So I hope you enjoyed this week's conversations, and I hope you have a great week ahead wherever in the world you are, and that you will join us again next week for another Beyond Biotech.